Drive south out of Charleston, and the road starts to narrow. The valleys close in. The towns arrive, strung out along a creek, one building deep on either side, because that is all the flat ground there is. You pass a storefront with a hand-lettered sign in the window from a business that closed in the 90s. You pass a school with a full-size parking lot and 11 cars in it. Somewhere up the hollow there is a mine portal with grass growing across the road that leads to it. This is the picture most Americans carry of southern West Virginia, and it is not a false picture. The buildings really are empty. The population really has collapsed. Anyone who tells you otherwise has not been here. But the version of this place that circulates in the rest of the country is not wrong so much as it is missing the part that explains everything else. What southern West Virginia actually is, underneath what most people think it is not a place history left behind. It is a place history never stopped using. If you find this kind of thing interesting, consider subscribing. Because at this moment, there are loaded coal trains running through those empty towns headed for ports. There is a disease in these counties that federal law was written in 1969 to eliminate, and it is more common now than it has been in 50 years. And in the hills above the hollows, land is being graded for machines that do not need people at all. Start with the thing everyone believes, because it is the load-bearing assumption underneath all the others. The belief is that West Virginia coal is finished, that the industry died somewhere around the mid-80s, that what remains is a handful of holdout operations running out the clock, and that the empty towns are the wreckage of an extraction economy that packed up and left. The empty towns are real. The extraction did not leave. West Virginia is currently the second largest coal-producing state in the United States, behind only Wyoming, and the largest producer east of the Mississippi River. In 2024, it produced 79.5 million short tons. It holds roughly 16% of the country's recoverable coal reserves, the third largest reserve base of any state. And it dominates a specific category most people have never thought about: metallurgical coal, the grade used not to generate electricity, but to make steel. In 2023, West Virginia accounted for 46% of all metallurgical coal produced in the United States, more than Alabama, Virginia, and Pennsylvania combined. Roughly 53% of the state's 2024 production went into export markets. The largest destinations were India, China, Indonesia, Japan, and South Korea. Sit with what that means physically. Nearly 1 in every 2 tons of American steel-making coal is cut out of an Appalachian mountain. When a car body is pressed in India, when a bridge girder is rolled in Japan, there are close to even odds that the carbon in that steel came out of a seam under these hills. The collapse people remember was real, but it was specific. It was thermal coal for domestic power plants, which lost to cheap natural gas after 2008. Metallurgical coal has no natural gas substitute in a blast furnace. Requires particular, low sulfur, low ash, high carbon seams, and Central Appalachia holds some of the best of them anywhere on the planet. So the region reads as post-industrial on its main streets and functions as a global commodity supplier on its rail lines. Those two facts sit about 400 feet apart. Here is the piece that makes the whole picture click into place. If production never stopped, then the people did not leave because the coal ran out. They left because the coal stopped needing them. West Virginia's coal employment peaked around 1940 at more than 130,000 miners. In 1950, the count stood at 127,304. By 1960, 1 decade, it had fallen to 59,098. Production did not fall with it. The state's single best year on record was 1997, at roughly 181 million tons. That record was set by approximately 18,000 miners. Today, the workforce is somewhere around 14,000 to 15,000. Mobile loading machines arrived first, then the continuous miner, then roof bolters. The United Mine Workers under John L. Lewis made an explicit bargain: accept a smaller workforce in exchange for higher wages and shorter hours for the men who remained. It worked for them. It was catastrophic for everyone else in the valley. As one McDowell County man put it to a reporter, put one machine in and you replace 200 men. Which means the depopulation of the coal fields began during a boom, not a bust. The timeline in most people's heads is off by about 30 years. The hollow that housed a company town of 2,000 in 1948 now supports one portal and a gravel lot with 11 pickup trucks in it. That mine ships more coal per year than the town's mine ever did. The train is moving. The town is not. 32.5%. That is the share of long-tenured underground coal miners in Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia who tested positive for black lung on X-rays taken over the past 5 years. Roughly 1 in 3 men, with at least 25 years underground among those screened. The figure comes from federal surveillance data published this month by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. It is the highest recorded rate since 1978. It is more than 4 times the late 90s low point of about 7%. When NIOSH last reported in 2018, the number was 20.6%. Coal workers' pneumoconiosis is supposed to be a historical condition. A black and white photograph. Something that happened to a man's grandfather before the Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of 1969 set enforceable dust limits. The disease was going away, and then it stopped going away, and then it came back harder than the generation the law was written to save. The reason is in the rock. The thick, easily worked seams of central Appalachia have largely been taken out. What is left is thinner, which means a machine cutting a seam now cuts through far more of the surrounding sandstone to get at it, and that sandstone contains quartz. Cutting quartz produces respirable crystalline silica, which is substantially more damaging to lung tissue than coal dust alone, and drives faster, more aggressive scarring. Rates are elevated across every tenure group above 10 years, which is another way of saying this is not confined to old men. NIOSH is careful about its own limits, and so should we be. Participation in its screening program is voluntary, and the sample is small enough that the regional estimate carries real uncertainty. The mining industry disputes what the findings should mean for regulation. It does not dispute the arithmetic. What it looks like is a light box in a radiologist's office in Coal Run Village, Kentucky. On a healthy chest film, the lower lung fields are dark and open. On these, they are clouded with dense white fibrotic mass. In men young enough to have children still in high school. There is no cure. The scarring only progresses. The industry that supposedly ended here is currently producing new cases of its signature disease at a rate not seen since the Carter administration. There is an overlook above the New River Gorge where the road pulls off and people stop to photograph the view. Sheer walls, a river 1,000 feet down, second-growth hardwood in every direction. Directly below that overlook inside the mountain runs a tunnel a little over 16,000 feet long. It was cut between 1930 and 1935 to divert water to a hydroelectric plant serving a Union Carbide Metals operation downstream. Around 3,000 men worked it. Roughly 3/4 of them were black migrants from the Deep South, drawn north by Depression-era wages. The rock they were cutting turned out to be exceptionally high in silica. The crews drilled it dry. Union Carbide acknowledged 109 deaths. A congressional investigation in 1936 put the toll at least 476. The most widely cited scholarly estimate by the physician-researcher Martin Cherniak is at least 764, and that is the figure the National Park Service uses today. Some academic citations run considerably higher. There's no agreed number, and there never will be, because a great many of the men who got sick went home to the South to die, and were never counted. For scale, On the most accepted figure, this killed more than 5 times as many people as the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Triangle has a name? It is in textbooks. This has a roadside marker with the company's own number on it. Part of the reason is that the record was actively degraded while it was being made. Company physicians commonly wrote the cause of death as pneumonia or tuberculosis or an invented condition they called tunnelitis, and those death certificates were later used as evidence that silicosis had not occurred on the job. Burials of black workers were contracted out at a reported $50 a head into unmarked graves in a nearby field. The burial records went missing. The 1936 House Committee on Labor concluded the tunnel had been driven with what it called a grave and inhuman disregard for the health, lives, and future of the employees. Congress took no action against the companies. It did that same year pass a law requiring respirators in dusty work. The men came out of that tunnel mouth-coated head to foot in white dust, like figures carved from chalk. Testimony recorded that the drinking water in the camp turned milky as the silica settled onto everything. The same mineral. 90 years earlier, same hills. In late August of 1921, roughly 10,000 armed coal miners assembled and marched toward Logan and Mingo counties. Waiting for them along a ridgeline were approximately 3,000 deputies, state police, and coal operator forces under the Logan County Sheriff, Don Chafin. What followed was the largest labor uprising in United States history and the largest armed uprising on American soil since the Civil War. An estimated 1 million rounds were fired. The trigger had come 3 weeks earlier. Sid Hatfield, the police chief of Mattawan, who had sided with Union miners against the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, was shot dead on the courthouse steps in Welch alongside his friend Ed Chambers, in front of both of their wives. During the fighting, Chafin's side rented private biplanes and dropped homemade bombs on the miners' positions, gunpowder packed with nuts and bolts, along with gas bombs. President Warren Harding sent in roughly 2,100 federal troops, plus an Army Air Service squadron under Billy Mitchell. The federal aircraft flew reconnaissance only. The bombing was done by the sheriff's rented planes. That is, aerial bombardment of American civilians on American ground, and most Americans learned the name of the event, if they learned it at all, about a century after it happened. The miners were overwhelmingly veterans of the First World War. When the Army arrived, most of them refused to fire on the United States and surrendered. They had tied red bandanas around their necks to tell each other apart. That is the origin story most often attached to the word redneck. The linguists argue about it. Now here is the part that is not history at all, but administration. On the 30th of March, 2009, the Blair Mountain battlefield, 1,669 acres, was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Within 9 months, it was delisted. 3 active mountaintop removal permits, held by Alpha Natural Resources and Arch Coal, overlapped the site. A coalition, including the Sierra Club, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and the West Virginia Labor History Association, went to court. On the 11th of April 2016, a federal judge vacated the removal as unlawful, finding that the Park Service had accepted, without verifying, a claim that a majority of property owners had objected. In June of 2018, the keeper of the National Register formally declared the 2009 removal erroneous. Most of the cited landowners, it turned out, had not objected at all. 9 years of litigation to put a battlefield back on a list. Listing does not by itself prohibit mining. It triggers reviews that make a surface permit substantially harder to advance. That is the whole of what was at stake. Today, there is one roadside marker at the foot of the ridge. Above it, a wooded skyline that is on paper, still inside a mining permit boundary. Under the leaf litter, shell casings, foxholes, entrenchments. If you grew up in these counties or you've driven US 52 through McDowell on your way somewhere else, I'd like to know what you thought you were looking at. The comments on these videos are consistently better than the videos. What follows goes underneath all of this. Who actually lived in these hollows and who owns the ground they stand on? The assumption is that Appalachian coal country is and always was white. Scots Irish stock, unchanged since settlement, homogeneous in a way that explains a lot of what people think they know about the place. For about 50 years, that was not true here. Between roughly 1880 and 1930, coal operators recruited tens of thousands of black workers out of Virginia and the Deep South, alongside immigrants from some 25 nationalities. West Virginia's black population went from 25,800 in 1880 to more than 64,000 by 1910 to nearly 115,000 by 1930. From the turn of the century into the early 30s, African Americans made up between 20 and 26% of the entire coal mining workforce in southern West Virginia. In McDowell County, the black population went from 3 people in 1880 to nearly 15,000 by 1910 and past 22,000 by 1930. By the 1,950 seconds, roughly a quarter of the county was black, against about 6% statewide. People called it the Free State of McDowell. Some of that was structural. Republican-aligned operators fought Democratic attempts to disenfranchise black voters and funded black schools, partly to protect a reliable constituency and partly to keep the state attractive to Southern recruits. The practical result was that black miners in these counties had voting rights, integrated union locals, and elected representation decades before that was true where they came from, none of which made it a refuge. In December of 1919, a white mob lynched 2 black miners at Chapmanville in Logan County Klan chapters formed in Logan, Mercer, and Kanawha in the early 20s. Both things were true at once, which is usually how this works. Then, the machines came, and mine managers commonly installed the first loading machines where the black crews were working. Between 1930 and 1980, the number of black coal miners in West Virginia fell from about 22,000 to fewer than 1,500, a 93% collapse. The Great Migration is remembered as a movement north to Chicago and Detroit. For half a century, a branch of it ran into these mountains, and then, inside a single generation, ran back out. There is a broader structural fact underneath that. By 1922, nearly 80% of West Virginia miners lived in company-owned houses and shopped at company stores. The National Park Service puts it at 78.8% in the southern coalfields. In Indiana and Illinois, the figure was 8.5%. That is a 9-fold difference between coalfields in the same country in the same decade. Keystone, McDowell County, once supported black-owned businesses, black doctors, and black lawyers. Its business district today is largely empty. Look at these mountains from a plane and the mining is obvious. Pale, angular clearings against continuous forest. The natural reading is that the mountains have been scarred, damaged on the surface, but fundamentally still the mountains. They are not still the mountains. In 2016, Duke University researchers published a study in Environmental Science and Technology comparing pre-mining topographic maps of southern West Virginia against aerial elevation data collected in 2010. They found that parts of the region are approximately 40% flatter than they were before mining began. Individual mines and valley fills ranged from 10 to 200 meters deep. 200 meters is roughly the height of a 60-story building, removed in negative, off the top of a ridge. That is not a scar on a landscape. That is a revision of the region's elevation data. The removed rock has to go somewhere, so it is engineered into the adjacent valleys as fill, which entombs the headwater streams that feed the Kanawha, the Big Sandy, and the Guyandotte. The EPA has estimated that roughly 2,000 miles of Appalachian headwater streams have been buried this way. The crushed rock leaches salts and metals, permanently raising conductivity downstream. The researchers' conclusion was that this alters how geology, water, and vegetation interact in ways likely to outlast every other form of land use in the region. The forest hides most of it, and there is something worth knowing about the forest too. As late as 1880, about 2/3 of what is now West Virginia was still original woodland. By 1920, after the timber boom, virtually the entire state had been cut over. Of more than 16 million acres of old growth, fewer than 300 acres are believed to survive. Today, West Virginia is the third most forested state in the country, behind Maine and New Hampshire, at around 78% cover. McDowell County alone is now over 93% forest, which means the ancient-looking woodland covering these hills is roughly a century old. It is younger than the coal industry it appears to predate. Tall, fast-grown tulip poplars, with trunks too slender for their height, standing over stone foundations of houses that are no longer on any map. Then there is the water. West Virginia carries about 140,355 acres of inventoried abandoned mine land and more than 1,500 miles of streams contaminated by acid mine drainage. Over 20% of all remaining unreclaimed mine land in the United States sits inside this one state. 1,500 miles of running water is roughly Charleston to Denver. And acid mine drainage does not stop. Water and oxygen reach sulfide minerals, exposed by mining, generate sulfuric acid, and mobilize iron and aluminum and manganese on their own, indefinitely, with no further human involvement. A creek running bright rust orange, the color of new brick, chalky white precipitate on every stone. Clear enough to see the bottom, no fish. Take the layers together and a pattern emerges that no single fact gets to on its own. Start with ownership, because it explains the rest retroactively. 2013 study by the West Virginia Center on Budget and Policy and the American Friends Service Committee found that not one of the state's top 10 private landowners was headquartered in West Virginia. In 6 counties, the top 10 landowners alone hold at least half of all private land, and 5 of those 6 are in the southern coal fields. Corporations own more than 3/4 of the surface acreage of Wyoming County and more than 60% of McDowell and Logan. The historical baseline is remarkable in itself. By 1810, as much as 93% of the land in what is now West Virginia was already held by absentee owners. So the reason almost nothing here was ever decided locally is that almost nothing here was ever owned locally. The disease, the disaster, the delisting, the flattened ridges, these are not separate failures. They are what happens when the ground, the minerals underneath it, and the company on top of it all answer to somewhere else. Now put the population against it. West Virginia peaked at 2,005,552 people in the 1950 census and has never returned to 2 million. It is the only state in the country whose population today is lower than it was in 1950. McDowell County, the leading coal-producing county in the entire United States in 1950, held 98,887 residents that year. The Census Bureau's 2025 estimate puts it at 16,878. That county now holds fewer people than it did in 1900 before the coal boom began. A courthouse, a hospital, a 4-lane bridge, and a full-size high school built for 100,000, still standing, still maintained, serving 17,000. And it was here, in that same county, that America first tested whether it could feed its own people. John F. Kennedy campaigned in these coal fields in 1960 and made a promise. His first executive order as president expanded food distribution, and on May 29, 1961, Alderson and Chloe Muncie of Painesville, he was an out-of-work miner, became the first recipients of food stamps in the modern American program. $95 for a household of 15. USDA records the first purchase as a can of pork and beans. 11 years earlier, that county led the nation in coal, so drive back down that road. Same narrow valley, same one building deep town, same grass growing over the mine road, except now the graded pad you pass on the hillside is not a mine. In 2025, West Virginia passed House Bill 2014, creating a statewide microgrid program that lets developers build off-grid power plants for large data centers, strips out the old requirement that those microgrids run on renewables, and preempts local zoning and noise ordinances. In March of 2026, Microsoft signed a letter of intent for roughly 1.35 gigawatts of AI compute at a campus in Mason County, a site whose developers have said could eventually reach 8. The state's entire utility-scale summer capacity is about 15. The offer is what it has always been: cheap fuel, permissive law, and a population with limited standing to object. These are not the hills that time forgot. They are the hills that time keeps coming back to, and it has never once arrived on their terms. If you want more of these, subscribe.